So as we come to the end of this chapter on local and session storage, what I wanted to cover is the concept of error handling, because there isn't too much information online, so it's good to rely on experience and practices for this. Now at the moment, we have this set item call, and we also have a get item call. Now I don't know about you, but you've probably used JSON parse and JSON stringify before. If you've ever incorrectly sent data back from an API perhaps, and tried to parse that data, it's going to give you some nasty errors down in the console, such as cannot read property O of undefined, or something like this. Now, there is one error that we can actually get with our local storage, if you haven't come across this before. Now, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we do in fact have a quota on how much data that we can set inside local storage. We can't just add megabytes and megabytes of data, or even gigabytes of data inside local storage, because it would lead to bad practices of websites storing way too much data on people's machines, let alone the ability to read them quickly, because don't forget, local and session storage are synchronous operations. So with that said, we do in fact have different quotas per browser, which means that in Chrome, for example, we might get 10 megabytes or 12 megabytes. And this is purely version dependent. Older versions of Chrome, Internet Explorer, Firefox, you name it, all have slightly different implementations, which also leads to the fact that they also have different implementations for errors. And this is something where experience comes into play, which will allow us to catch any errors when we are setting an item. Now, this is nice and easy, and it's actually super minimal. Typically what we would do is something like this, where we would say try. If there's an error, we're going to simply catch that particular error. And at some point, we would do something like this and warn out that particular error. So what we can do is save out this console warn, jump back into our editor, and what we're going to do is just put way too much data inside our local storage. So for this, we're going to say ls.set. We can add any kind of property that we do in fact like. We can then pass in a new array, and then we're going to join it with any character that you like. I'm just going to use a dash for this. So inside our new array, we're going to say 12 multiplied by 1024 multiplied by 1024. So this is going to create a ginormous string and then essentially set it, or at least attempt to set it. When we hit save, we're going to then see a DOM exception, failed to execute set item on storage, setting the value of foo exceeded the quota. So this is a cheap way that we can quickly demonstrate cramming or attempting to cram way too much data inside of our local storage, which leads us to getting a particular error. Now the error object you can see here says DOM exception. So this is the type of error which is being given to us. Now lots of different browsers give us lots of different implementations. And on this error object, we have things like the error name, the error code, the error message. And there isn't really a great agreement, or at least there wasn't, on what that error message and the codes should be. For instance, in older versions of Firefox, the error code was 1014. In Safari and Google Chrome, for example, which are likely because it's a WebKit browser, or at least was a WebKit browser before the Blink engine arrived, the exception code was 22. The error also had a name property with a value of quota exceeded error. And this was also slightly different. In Firefox, for example, it would be a different error name to Google Chrome, and Safari would also have a different error name. However, one common thing persists with these errors, and that is when we check the type of the error. And we could do this by looking at the instance of. So when I just mentioned that we have this DOM exception, we can say if our error is an instance of our DOM exception. Then we in fact know that it is a local storage exception, which means that we could take our console warning and then drop it into our if statement above. So we're only going to handle the errors at this point, and it's completely up to you how you want to do this. You could put an alert in or show the user some information that the local storage was trying to set a value that was far too big. So I hope that makes sense. And ideally, we would just use this one-line instance of the DOM exception on the error object, because regardless of what browser we're in, the DOM exception is going to persist. Now, similarly, we don't really need to do something like this where we are parsing our JSON. However, it might be a good practice for us to wrap things inside of a try catch. So what I'm going to do is say try and catch that error and we can just simply console.warn it out. So this is then going to allow us to handle any of those errors. We don't need to check if it is a particular error. So this is really going to tell us if the quota has been exceeded, then we can at least handle those errors. This is just going to tell us if anything went wrong with fetching the data. Because don't forget, we can actually do something like this. We can jump into our application and we can in fact start editing these values. So if we were to start, or a user was to start editing those values, this allows us to then gracefully handle them. Or if, for example, we are setting some bad data that's formatted incorrectly perhaps, we can either handle it in here, and as a second layer, we can also handle it when fetching that property from our local storage. So that's it for this video. We've talked about try and catch this instance of a DOM exception, and we've now implemented in a much safer way, and you can see why I've broken this out into a storage module, because we don't want to write all of this kind of code every single time. We want to set something purely to local storage. We don't want to think about stringifying. We don't want to think about error catching. We just want to use a nice and simple API where we just call local storage set this and set this. We could, of course, do something and pass in a callback perhaps if we wanted to pass in a function and run this if this was an error. And we could take the function from inside of here and we could do anything we like. We could call the function if it was a particular error and then pass the error message in. We could then grab the error in here and alert it, you name it. So it's completely up to you if you want to expand your code base like so. And there's just a few ideas for you if you wanted to go ahead and create your own local storage module, or maybe you're working with local storage already and this gives you a couple of ideas on how to implement it with an existing application.